Have you ever wondered why some men are remembered as monsters, while others, often just as ruthless, are hailed as heroes? Why history elevates some into legends and condemns others into the shadows of fear and infamy? The truth is, history doesn't always tell us what happened. It tells us what the victors wanted us to believe. And if you think you know Attila the Hun, think again. When Rome trembled at the edge of collapse, it didn't just need armies. It needed a story, a villain. A force so terrifying that the mere mention of his name would unite a fractured empire through fear. That story was Attila. To the Romans, he was the Scourge of God, a harbinger of doom, a shadow upon the civilized world. But was he really that? Or was he a mirror reflecting the fears, failures, and insecurities of a dying superpower? Let's peel back the layers of myth and look through the eyes of his enemies. The Rome that described Attila was not the same Rome that once ruled the world with confidence and power. It was an empire crumbling under its own weight, desperate for coherence. Plagued by internal divisions and economic decline, to preserve its image, it needed an external threat, a figure so brutal, so inhuman, that he could justify any military loss, any retreat, and any act of cruelty in response. That's where the psychology of fear begins. Rome didn't just fight Attila on the battlefield. It fought him in the minds of its citizens. Through speeches, chronicles, and religious sermons, Attila was not portrayed as a man, but as a storm sent from the heavens to punish a sinful empire. Jordanes, Priscus, and other Roman chroniclers weren't merely historians, they were propagandists, crafting a symbol that served a political function, exaggerated, distorted, and dramatized. They wrote of eyes that glowed, of laughter like thunder, of cruelty without conscience. But read closely, and you'll see contradictions, and glimpses of another reality. The truth is, the real Attila was far more complex. A master strategist, a diplomat, and above all, a leader who understood the power of perception. His armies moved like ghosts, striking where no defense could be prepared, retreating before retaliation and reappearing where least expected. But Attila didn't conquer purely through violence. He negotiated with emperors, forged alliances, and demanded tribute with the precision of a politician. The Romans feared him not just for what he did, but for what he might do next. This fear wasn't baseless. His campaigns into Gaul and Italy shook the foundations of Rome. But what terrified the Roman psyche even more was how efficiently he controlled the narrative outside of their grasp. The Huns were not savages foaming at the mouth. They had structured, disciplined, even an internal code of honor. But to admit this would be to admit that Rome's enemy wasn't beneath them. He was beside them, equal, or perhaps superior. The letters of Priscus offer a rare crack in the Roman narrative. In one account, Priscus describes a diplomatic visit to Attila's court, expecting barbarism but finding order, etiquette, and a leader who commanded both fear and respect among his own. Attila was firm, sharp-witted, and perceptive. He drank modestly, unlike the Roman envoys. His discipline was clear. If this was the monster of legend, where were the signs of madness? But Rome couldn't afford nuance, so they turned him into a myth, a beast, a divine punishment. This tactic wasn't new, nor has it disappeared. The creation of mythical enemies is a tool used by powers throughout history. When a nation weakens, when internal conflict festers, the easiest unifier is fear of the other. And Attila was the perfect other. He spoke a different language. He looked different. He moved differently. His world was not theirs. And in that gap of understanding, Rome poured terror. It's in this tension between man and myth that we begin to see the real power of the Roman machine, not just in legions and architecture, but in narrative. Rome turned its defeats into victories through stories. It elevated its suffering into sacrifice. And it painted its enemies in such darkness that even their virtues became suspect. He is generous, then he manipulates. He is disciplined, then he's planning something worse. Once cast as evil, everything a man does is seen through a poisoned lens. Attila's campaigns were devastating, but they were also strategic, aimed at political leverage as much as conquest. His invasion of Gaul ended not in total destruction, but in the famous Battle of the Catalonian Plains, where Romans and their allies halted his advance. Though he didn't conquer Rome itself, the fear he inspired was enough to shake the empire's foundations. Rome paid tributes and negotiated with Attila, treating him as a legitimate power despite their fear. Yet, what terrifies even more is how Attila mastered the battlefield of perception. His reputation was a weapon, as sharp as any sword. He knew the value of fear and legend and used them to keep his enemies off balance. This psychological warfare was decades ahead of its time, showing that power is as much about control of minds as control of lands, and maybe the most unsettling part of it all. Is that the myth of Attila still works? Even today we use the same formula? We label, we demonize, we simplify. In modern politics, in media, in warfare, it's always easier to create an enemy than to face the complexities of our own failures. What Rome did to Attila wasn't just historical, it was archetypal. They didn't need him to be real, they needed him to be useful. A living symbol of chaos to justify control. That formula, still being used by the powerful, again and again. So when you hear the name Attila, don't think of a madman riding across scorched fields. Think of a man who played the world's greatest empire at its own game, and nearly won. Think of how power rewrites memory, how fear becomes legend, and how sometimes the real barbarian isn't the one outside the gates, but the one writing the story. Because when history is written with trembling hands and trembling hearts, it ceases to be history, it becomes warning, a mirror, and those who dare to look into it must be willing to question everything, not just the figures painted as villains, but the hands that held the brush. Attila, in the end, forces us to confront our deepest bias, that order always means justice, and that chaos must always be crushed. But what if order was built on rot, and chaos was only clarity in motion? And now, you've seen through the veil. You've walked in the shadow of the myth, and emerged with a deeper understanding of not just Attila, but the dangerous comfort of single-sided stories. If this changed how you see empires, fear, and truth itself, share it. Help others see what you now know. Subscribe to Vertex of Time, because we don't just revisit history, we challenge it, we tear down the masks. And what remains is power, raw and undistorted.